This is the moment Israel rewrote the rules of what a naval blockade means. And every government, every sailor, and every international lawyer woke up this morning in a world where the rules have fundamentally changed. Picture what happened in the dark waters of the Mediterranean Sea late Wednesday night, April 29, 2026. Somewhere between the Greek island of Crete and the open sea, roughly 600 nautical miles, more than 1,000 kilometers from Gaza's coast, civilian boats carrying doctors, activists, elected lawmakers, and aid workers were sailing peacefully through international waters. These were not warships. They were not smuggling weapons. They were carrying food, medicine, and 1,000 people from 70 countries who had paid their way onto this mission because they believed the world's courts and cameras demanded a witness. Then the radios went dead, not because of a technical fault, because Israel jammed them. Every channel went down simultaneously. The VHF Maritime Emergency SOS channel that sailors use to call for help when their lives are at risk, the GPS navigation system, the satellite bands, the flotilla's internal coordination frequencies, all of it silenced in a single sweep. And then, out of the darkness, Israeli military speedboats emerged with lasers pointing and semi-automatic weapons raised. Passengers were ordered to the front of the boats. They were told to get on their hands and knees. And over the jammed radio channels, instead of emergency signals or communications, one activist reported hearing something that will be remembered as one of the most chilling details of this entire event. Israel was playing music through the frequencies it had taken over, as what one participant described as some sort of psychological warfare. As of 9:47 a.m. on Thursday, April 30th, 2026, Israel has seized 7 vessels from the Global Sumud Flotilla. Communication has been lost with 11 boats. The Israeli military confirmed it acted far from Israeli shores, in waters where, as of yesterday, no country had ever conducted a naval intercept of this kind at anything close to this distance. The previous furthest Israeli interception of an aid flotilla was 72 nautical miles from Gaza. This operation happened more than 600 nautical miles away. That is not an incremental expansion of enforcement. It is a strategic declaration about how far Israel's military reach now extends into international sea lanes used by every nation on Earth. In this deep dive, we are going to show you exactly how this operation was designed and why Israel chose to strike this far from its shores, expose what the Israeli government told its own media about why the surprise element was the entire point, reveal what jamming civilian SOS and GPS signals in international waters means legally and for every sailor on the Mediterranean, explain why this is the most diplomatically dangerous thing Israel has done in Europe since 2010, and show you the full weight of what 1,000 people from 70 countries being stopped at gunpoint on their hands and knees in open international waters means for the global conversation about Gaza. Israel didn't just stop a flotilla, it announced that it will stop any flotilla anywhere in the Mediterranean at any time of its choosing. The world is only beginning to understand what that means. To understand why this operation is being called unprecedented, you need to understand the history of what came before it. Because the story of the Global Sumud Flotilla is not new, and Israel has a long, documented, and increasingly aggressive record of how it handles civilian ships that try to reach Gaza. Go back to 2010. The Turkish-flagged Mavi Marmara, carrying hundreds of humanitarian activists, was intercepted by Israeli commandos in international waters. The boarding turned violent. Israeli forces killed 10 Turkish nationals. A 10th person died years later from wounds sustained that day. The incident fractured Israeli-Turkish diplomatic relations for years, triggered emergency sessions of the UN Security Council, and produced a legal investigation that concluded Israel's blockade of Gaza was legal in principle, but that its enforcement in that instance had involved unacceptable and illegal uses of force. The Mavi Marmara became the defining reference point for how Israeli naval blockade enforcement was understood under international law. Then came the first Global Sumud Flotilla in September and October 2025. More than 40 boats, 500 participants. They were intercepted 72 nautical miles from Gaza. More than 450 people were arrested, including Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, the grandson of Nelson Mandela, and a sitting member of the European Parliament. Detainees were taken to Israel, several alleged physical and psychological abuse while in custody. The intercept sparked mass protests across Europe. Every major human rights organization issued condemnations, and the flotilla organizers looked at what happened, studied where Israel's reach had gone, and concluded that 72 nautical miles was the outer edge of what Israel was prepared to do. They were wrong. On April 12, 2026, the Spring 2026 mission departed from Barcelona. 70 vessels, nearly 1,000 participants from 70 countries. The Malaysian government confirmed official state support for the mission, the first time a national government had formally backed a flotilla attempt to reach Gaza. More than 10 Turkish lawmakers from both the governing party and the opposition traveled to Brussels the week before departure to sign the Brussels Declaration, which called for a UN-verified humanitarian maritime corridor to Gaza. The flotilla also carried the Greenpeace vessel Arctic Sunrise, which was providing logistical and communications support. This was not a protest. It was a coordinated, internationally backed, government-supported humanitarian operation sailing under flags from dozens of nations. Israel had been tracking it since the day it left port. It had 18 days to plan. And the decision made at the highest level of Israel's government was not to wait and intercept near Gaza. It was to intercept far, fast, and by complete surprise before the world's cameras could position themselves, before diplomatic interventions could be requested, and before the flotilla had any chance to maneuver or separate or scatter into groups too small to manage. The interception was not reactive. It was deliberate, planned, and designed to establish something new. At 6:43 p.m. UTC on Wednesday, April 29, 2026, the Greenpeace vessel Arctic Sunrise received a radio transmission on the General International Maritime Channel 16. The sender identified itself as the Israeli Navy. The message was structured and formal, warning flotilla vessels to change course immediately, return to port of origin, or proceed to the port of Ashdod for security inspection. It stated that continuing toward Gaza placed participants' safety at risk, and that the IDF would take all necessary measures at its disposal to enforce a lawful maritime security blockade. Then at 6:43 p.m., plus approximately 4 minutes, all communications went down. The jamming was not partial. According to Greenpeace's detailed account, the signal suppression covered the VHF Maritime Emergency SOS channel, the universal distress frequency that international maritime law requires all vessels to monitor, and that no military force is permitted to jam under any circumstances because lives at sea depend on it. The GPS global navigation satellite system went dark. The Iridium satellite communication bands used for emergency backup contact went silent, and the internal VHF coordination channels the flotilla used to maintain contact between its 70-plus vessels were silenced simultaneously. In the open ocean, at night, with no GPS and no emergency channel, 1,000 people across dozens of boats were navigating blind. The speedboats came in rigid inflatable configuration, ribs, launched from larger Israeli naval vessels positioned beyond the immediate visible horizon. Activists on board described lasers being swept across their decks from the approaching boats, followed by personnel pointing semi-automatic weapons and issuing commands in English and Hebrew simultaneously. Tariq Raouf, a writer and activist aboard one of the vessels, told Al Jazeera in real time what he was witnessing. The flotilla being surrounded by large Israeli military ships, the communications blackout, and the music playing across the jammed radio channels in what he called psychological warfare. But while the boarding operation was being executed on at least 7 confirmed vessels, something else was also happening simultaneously that almost nobody was reporting on in the moment. Israel's foreign ministry was in real time posting to X and briefing Israeli domestic media with its own framing of what was being seized. The ministry wrote that the medical aid found on board the flotilla vessels consisted of condoms and drugs. The framing was deliberate, designed to undercut the humanitarian mission narrative before any activist could reach a camera or a phone to give their own account. The mockery landed before the facts did. While Israeli authorities were framing the seizure as a security operation against a Hamas-linked provocation, 11 vessels had completely lost contact with organizers on shore. Flotilla spokesperson Gur Sabar, speaking to Al Jazeera from Toronto, said plainly, "This is illegal under international law. Israel has no jurisdiction in these waters." Boarding these boats amounts to illegal detention, potentially kidnapping on the high seas. He called on every government whose citizens were aboard to act immediately, saying silence in this moment is absolute complicity. Pause. An anonymous Israeli military source, speaking to Israeli Army radio, explained the strategy in a single sentence that defines the entire operation. The goal was to surprise the flotilla by striking so far from Gaza. This was not an enforcement action. It was a psychological and strategic decision to demonstrate that Israel's blockade enforcement extends anywhere in the Mediterranean that Israel chooses, at any distance from its coast, with no warning and complete communication suppression. According to Israeli media briefed by anonymous military officials after the operation began, the decision to intercept at this extraordinary distance was made at the political echelon, meaning it was approved by Israel's government directly, not decided operationally by naval commanders. The scale of the flotilla, more than 100 vessels carrying about 1,000 activists, was cited as the specific reason for the early intercept. Israeli officials calculated that a flotilla of this size, if allowed to approach within the range of previous intercepts, would generate a media and diplomatic crisis too large to manage cleanly. We have learned from sources familiar with Israeli strategic planning that the operational doctrine applied here was developed directly from the failures and complications of the October 2025 intercept. In that operation, conducted at 72 nautical miles from Gaza, the world's cameras had time to position. European governments had time to make calls. The footage of Greta Thunberg and other high-profile activists being arrested spread globally before Israel could control the narrative. Detainees alleged abuse. Several European governments summoned Israeli ambassadors. Protests erupted in major cities for weeks. Internally, the lessons drawn were clear. The media window that opens between a flotilla's last known position and its interception must be closed. The only way to close it is to strike before the window opens. Sources close to the Israeli government say a secondary calculation was also at play. By intercepting in waters west of Crete, Israel ensured that the physical location of the operation fell outside the zones where European coastal state authorities had any rapid response capability. Italy and Spain, which had deployed vessels to escort the previous flotilla after reported drone attacks on its ships, would have no time to reposition. By the time any European naval vessel could reach the scene, the operation would be complete and the seized boats would be underway toward Ashdod. The Israeli Foreign Ministry's immediate public mockery, the claim about condoms and drugs in the aid cargo, was also a calculated move. In the 2025 interception, Israel had alleged Hamas' financial involvement in the flotilla. This time, the mockery was designed to shape the domestic Israeli narrative and to preemptively discredit the mission with audiences in countries whose governments might otherwise be inclined to issue strong protests. Is what Israel did legal? That question is not simple, and the answer matters for every nation in the world. Follow the legal architecture carefully. Israel maintains a naval blockade of Gaza that it claims is legal under the laws of armed conflict because it is at war with Hamas. International maritime law permits a belligerent to declare a naval blockade and to enforce it on vessels attempting to breach it, but it imposes strict conditions. The blockade must be publicly declared. It must be effectively enforced. It must not cut off civilians from humanitarian aid to the point of starvation. And critically, interception of neutral vessels in international waters must be proportional and must not endanger the safety of the vessel's passengers. Jamming emergency SOS frequencies in international waters does not meet any proportionality standard that international maritime law recognizes. This is the power shift that the legal world is absorbing right now. If Israel's interception at 600 nautical miles with GPS and SOS jamming in international waters is permitted to stand without consequence, it establishes a precedent that any nation claiming a naval blockade can suppress civilian communications and conduct armed boardings anywhere on the high seas. That is not a precedent that benefits only Israel. It is a precedent that every authoritarian government, every naval power, and every state in an ongoing conflict will cite the next time it wants to conduct a long-range maritime enforcement operation on civilian vessels. What legal scholars will describe as the Crete Precedent of April 2026 is specifically dangerous because of the communications jamming dimension. The Mavi Marmara in 2010 was violent and deadly, but it did not jam SOS frequencies. It did not suppress GPS navigation. The spring 2026 mission Intercept introduced a new operational element that international maritime law has no established framework to address, because no prior incident in history has involved the deliberate military suppression of civilian distress frequencies in peacetime international shipping lanes on this scale. The legal exposure for Israel across multiple jurisdictions is significant. The International Court of Justice is already adjudicating South Africa's genocide case related to Gaza. The International Criminal Court has active proceedings involving Israeli military conduct in Gaza. The addition of 1,000 activists from 70 countries being seized at gunpoint while their SOS and GPS systems are jammed, with at least one government, Malaysia, having provided official state support to the mission, creates a set of potential legal filings in multiple jurisdictions that Israel's legal teams will be managing for years. Here is the cascade of consequences now unfolding across 70 countries simultaneously. Every government whose citizens were on those boats is going to receive a consular request within hours. That means diplomatic notes are going to land on desks in Ankara, Kuala Lumpur, Madrid, Rome, Paris, Brussels, Dublin, and dozens of other capitals before the end of the day. Turkey is particularly important. The 2010 Mavi Marmara killed 10 Turkish nationals and strained Turkish-Israeli relations for years. Turkey now has lawmakers aboard the seized vessels. If a single Turkish citizen is harmed or mistreated in Israeli custody, the diplomatic consequences will not be contained to a formal protest. They will land in a Turkish domestic political environment that is already deeply inflamed over Gaza, with a government that has been one of the loudest and most consequential international voices calling Israel's conduct in Gaza a genocide. Malaysia is a different category of complication entirely. A government, not activists, not NGOs, but an actual state, formally backed this flotilla. When Israel boards and seizes vessels from a state-backed mission in international waters, it is not just stopping humanitarian activists. It is effectively conducting a maritime interdiction against vessels operating under the political umbrella of a sovereign government. Malaysia has no bilateral relationship with Israel to protect. It has nothing to lose diplomatically by pursuing every available international legal mechanism, and its involvement gives the flotilla a state actor with standing to file in international forums that private organizations do not have. The European reaction is the one that matters most for Israel's long-term diplomatic positioning. Italy and Spain had already deployed naval assets to the previous flotilla after drone attacks were reported on its ships. The previous intercept at 72 nautical miles triggered mass street protests in major European cities. This intercept at 8 times that distance with full communications jamming, including emergency SOS frequencies, with government-backed participants and Greenpeace's Arctic Sunrise among the seized vessels, is landing in a European political environment that has been moving steadily toward formal sanctions consideration for Israeli conduct in Gaza. The Gaza death toll stands at 72599 killed and 1724 injured, according to figures that were current before today's operation. That number has been accumulating for nearly 3 years. The humanitarian situation that the Global Sumud Flotilla was sailing toward, the blockade that has been in place since 2007, the famine conditions documented by the UN's food security systems, has not improved. And today, 1,000 people who tried to physically challenge that blockade are either seized, jammed into silence, or navigating blind in the Mediterranean without GPS. There is an image that will define how this moment is remembered. And it is not the image of boats being boarded. It is the image of people on their hands and knees on the deck of a small civilian vessel in the dark Mediterranean while music plays over the silenced radio channels. That image is not propaganda from either side. It is the testimony of people who were there. And it will travel through every news outlet, every parliamentary session, every international court filing, every protest in every capital where one of those 70 countries has a government whose citizens were forced to their knees in international waters. You can call a flotilla a political provocation. You can find condoms in the medical cargo and hold them up for cameras. You can strike 1,000 kilometers from your own shore and frame it as protecting your national security. but you cannot make the image of armed speedboats with lasers drawn disappear from the waters west of Crete. You cannot unjam the emergency frequencies. You cannot put back the precedent of what distance a military blockade enforcement can now extend across international sea lanes used by every trading nation on Earth. So where does this stand as of this morning? Israel has established the furthest maritime interdiction in flotilla history by a factor of more than 8. 7 boats are confirmed seized. 11 have lost contact. 1,000 people from 70 countries are somewhere in the Mediterranean, some on their hands and knees, some in Israeli naval custody, some navigating without GPS toward whatever port they can find. Greenpeace's Arctic Sunrise, a recognized international environmental and humanitarian vessel, is among those whose communications have been disrupted. The Brussels Declaration, signed by elected parliamentarians from dozens of countries just 8 days ago, calling for a UN-verified maritime corridor to Gaza, has just been answered by Israel with armed speedboats and a communications blackout. In the days ahead, expect emergency consular responses from at least a dozen governments. Turkey will be the loudest and most consequential voice. Expect the Malaysian government to pursue formal diplomatic and legal channels, given its state-level involvement. Expect emergency motions in the European Parliament, where the previous interception had already moved multiple delegations toward formal sanction votes. Expect ICJ and ICC filings to reference today's operation as part of the broader legal case being built around Israeli conduct in Gaza and in international waters. And expect the Global Sumud Flotilla to announce a third larger mission, because the pattern of the previous 2 intercepts produced more international solidarity and more state-level support, not less. A third mission will likely be larger than all previous ones combined. The question that every maritime lawyer, every foreign ministry legal advisor, and every naval commander in the world is asking this morning is the same question. If 600 nautical miles is acceptable, where does the line actually sit? And if there is no line, what does that mean for the freedom of the seas that every trading nation on Earth depends on? The boats are seized, the radios are silent, the music is still playing on the jammed channels. Subscribe and stay locked in. We are monitoring the consular response from Turkey, Malaysia, and the European Union in real time. The moment any government moves from diplomatic protest to concrete legal or sanctions action, we will break it down before anyone else frames it. This is not the end of the flotilla story. It is the beginning of the next, much larger chapter. Watch closely.